Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday around 5 p.m. And this week's episode, we, as you may have noticed, have another guest speaker we're really excited to have with us. So I'm going to introduce her in a moment. But the theme of today's episode is talking about the intersection between racism and interpersonal violence and seeing how they connect and how we can talk about these issues together and how they exist within each other. So we have today with us Dr. Rée Gunter from Western Connecticut State University. She's the Director of Counseling Services at WCSU. So we're really excited to have you here with us today. So thank you for joining us and for bearing with us through technology in the virtual world that we're in. Did you want to give a quick kind of introduction to yourself in addition to your title at the university?
Sure. This should be my 7th year at the university as the Director of the Counseling Services. Prior to that, I had a little break and worked in my private practice. As well as the private practice, I do workshops for different community agencies. And let me see, and then I was a counselor for the university for a couple years. But prior to that, I also worked in community agency, nonprofit organizations, and primarily they were in communities of color. So definitely on the topic that we're discussing today.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And we're so excited to hear your perspective on things and your thoughts and bringing your experience to this conversation. That's a very important conversation. I think it's fair, we're colleagues and we've worked together for a few years now, but I know that this topic is nerve-wracking for people to discuss and to bring up. So we really wanted to address it because obviously, and I think I can speak for Sydney here, we are very much aware that Sydney and I are speaking from the perspective of white women and that we need to include perspectives of people of color and really just representing everyone. So I think that's why we were particularly excited to have this conversation today to kind of bring more perspectives that are important, need to bring forward. So that being said, we wanted to start off with a couple of statistics to kind of set the tone for our conversation today. So I'm going to just bring this up to my screen. So I'm just going to read them out and then we can kind of talk about reactions, thoughts, why we think these are, the case. So the first statistic, this one comes from the American Public Health Association, and it states that African-American females experience intimate partner violence at a rate 35% higher than that of white females and about 2.5 times the rate of women of other races. However, they are less likely than white women to use social services, battered women's programs, or go to the hospital because of domestic violence. The next statistic is from the CDC, and this one states 45.1% of Black women and 40.1% of Black men have experienced intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and or intimate partner stalking in their lifetimes. And then the last statistic is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and U.S. Department of Justice. And this one states, most sexual assault done against African-American women goes unreported. So for every African-American woman that reports her rape, at least 15 African-American women do not report theirs. So I know that was a lot, words altogether, but really sets the tone for why we're having this conversation today, right? So what are your kind of initial thoughts and reactions hearing those statistics and, what the reality is, I guess?
Unfortunately, not shocked. I think that what comes to play is racism and domestic violence it's the intersection of two forms of social injustices. And so for that reason, it's kind of like the double whammy for women of color, especially African-American women. And so, we know what the stigma is around domestic violence. So it's just another layer of, are you going to be believed? You don't have a voice in society based on the way that particularly African Americans are looked upon in society, unfortunately, and we can see that with the racial current division that we're experiencing. So many women of color believe that they're, which is very true. Are they going to be believed, and is it worth doing that, reporting it? Right. Because is it going to go anywhere? And then, although they may be abused, is the perpetrator is most likely is someone that they love. Are they going to be treated fairly? And what does that mean when they're approached by law enforcement? You know, you know, are they going to be killed just when the police show up? Right. So you're not only you're dealing with, in the back of your mind, the individual racism, systematic racism, institutionalized racism. So you just
layer upon layer upon layer.
Yeah. Is it worth it? I mean, you don't know. Then you know that you may have to, you'll be separated from your family. And how could you do that? How could you oust the community if you were to go to the institution, you know, the system per se? And then where do you go once you go to these agencies? So are the agencies going to be culturally sensitive to your needs? Are they going to understand you? So that's a whole nother layer. So you're reporting it, but then where do you go? And are they going to understand what you're going through and what your world looks like? And then, you know, recognizing for immigrant and undocumented individuals, that's a whole nother layer. Am I going to get deported? Am I going to be separated from my children? So it's really the question of which risk is higher.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
You know,
I think that's so interesting. Sorry if I just cut you off. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm good.
I was just going to say that, like, so in the work that I do with my colleagues in the direct service department at the Women's Center, I hear a lot about undocumented survivors and, like, what is those fears about going forward and reporting. And I also hear a lot from our clients, even on campus, like, I don't want to ruin their life or, you know, by coming forward and reporting. But I'm so glad that you brought up too, that, like, you know, is he going to be killed if my offender, like, because of the police, or what's going to happen that way? And I think that, to me, just hearing you say that was so jarring, and something I haven't specifically heard or thought of in the realm of, like, calling the police as a result of domestic violence. I've definitely, like, recognizing, you know, how the intersection of, like, sexual violence, domestic violence, and racism, and maybe, you know, what those fears might be like, but, like, hearing it said out loud so directly is just very, like, wow. Because I've thought about it. I understand, like, barriers of reporting just from what I've read. Like, it's certainly not my own experience, because, you know, maybe that's where I'm coming, or it is where I'm coming from. But I'm really glad that you just said that, because even as an advocate, I'm like, yeah, like, that's a whole nother level to the conversation. And I'm used to supporting clients through, like, I don't want to ruin his life if I report it, but they're not often thinking of the system that you're talking about.
Well, as well as the victim, you know, recognizing when, for a person of color, when the police shows up, usually it's an automatic trigger of, am I going to lose my life?
Right. Am I safe? Right. Which should be the opposite. Yeah.
Right. I mean, not only, you know, the perpetrator, but the victim is feeling that as well, of what is going to happen. You know, when we drive down the street and a police car is behind me, I'm not doing anything wrong, but as a woman of color, it still is like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Right. Which it's like, we talk about all the barriers for any victims of domestic sexual violence, for reporting, for, you know, reaching out to resources. And I think that first statistic of talking about, like, how much more likely, particularly women of color, are experiencing this, but they're so much less likely to contact, you know, support, or to be connected to resources, that, like, it's such a huge problem. And I you know, it's a big problem in just like numbers wise, right? Of just how many people are we missing because they don't feel safe accessing these different resources. Like that's, you know, awful. Like how, and I think that brings us to like the question of, you know, we obviously as the advocates at the Women's Center, like recognize the fact that we're white, obviously, and that maybe students of color may want to see someone who looks like them when they're coming in to receive support. And so bringing that to like, what can we do as advocates to meet the needs of students of color or just people of color in general, but since we work on the campus, you know, be culturally sensitive and aware and make sure that we're creating that space that does feel safe for them.
I think being able to acknowledge the difference, being in tune to what you may consider as resistance to disclosure and being able to acknowledge it. I understand that you may not be comfortable with what's going on, and if you know the background of the circumstances of, I'm a white person, I know that this may be uncomfortable. You may be concerned about what have you in terms of what the ramifications are. But I think if we can talk about what your concerns are, then I can help you better navigate your concerns and affirming that they are valid concerns.
Right.
And I think when we talk about trauma, we always say, what happened? Informed trauma, when we, you know, the informed trauma is what happened. I think always thinking in the back of your mind when interacting with victims of color, being curious about how could race have played a part in this.
Yeah.
I like how you said that, like being curious about it, because then it helps to approach it in a trauma-informed way of like, what are the other layers of trauma that could be present here, instead of only looking through that one single lens of like sexual violence or domestic violence.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And not
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it makes me think of the, like, I've been reading a lot about, you know, don't make the person of color or the person in front of you who is in that marginalized community the person who now has to educate you on how to help them, right? And I feel like that's a huge part of our job as advocates who are white, to make sure that we're not making this person come into our space and then having to educate us on how best to support them. Like, obviously, like, trusting that they know what's best for them, right? And that's this kind of separate piece, but not telling us, like, you know, racism exists, like, you know, like not having to teach us about what racism looks like. We can do that work to then try to show up in the best way we can for them.
Right. And I would be like, I would assume that racism played a part. They may not even acknowledge it, but you should assume that racism played a part, and you're curious, even if they don't know how it played a part, of questioning yourself when asking it those questions of how it could have impacted the situation.
Yeah.
And if you ask those questions, that's when they will realize, oh, wow, this person does really understand or have some concept. No one's ever going to get it perfect, but the mere fact that it enters your mind is the first step of gaining that rapport and really being able to help the person get through whatever the situation is.
Right. Yeah, like seeing them as a whole person.
Correct.
Yeah.
And not assuming you know, and not necessarily refraining necessarily from stereotypes. You know, I think that, for instance, you know, Black women are looked at as Black strong women, which we are, but but we do have weak moments, and being able to get in touch and give permission for permission that it's okay to receive help.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. That, like, the stereotypes and assumptions of, like, oh, because of these things I've heard, I'm associating you with, like, you're strong, you don't need support or like, you've got this. And it's like, no, allowing this person to be vulnerable and real and like move through all of their emotions that are valid, and that they're layered as a person. Right. Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, because that is definitely, I think, a stereotype. And what is it called? The unconscious bias? No. Right? Yeah. Like of kind of using those stereotypes to inform how you're gonna like approach a client in front of you. And so it's really, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's huge, I think, for advocates particularly.
Yeah. Right.
And for friends, right? Or like peers who are watching their friend go through something.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because, you know, you were mentioning before, like, as the advocate, as the counselor, assuming that racism played a part and finding the ways to ask those questions in a sensitive way is something that I'm going to take with me forever about like my just work as a counselor. But I think because it relates or rings a lot of bells of like how we do that work to like, oh my goodness, my battery's running low. But how we do that work to explain anything to our clients and help them look at things from different perspectives, no matter what we're kind of talking about. But I think in the role of friendships too, because we're kind of talking to our students here, you know, helping a friend be willing to like feel safe to maybe explore that might have been a part of their experience too, that racism might have played a part. How can students help their friends or their peers or even our, you know, RAs and ARMs and things like that, if they receive a disclosure, make space for that too? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. So how you're asking how friends could do that?
I think so. And maybe it's not a specific direct answer, but yeah.
I think that one is getting in touch with when you were, in layman's term, the underdog, or when you were in that marginalized or inferior position, to be able to get in touch with what does that feel like, and being able to sit with that and recognize that's what people of color go through life all the time.
Right.
And so remembering what was that like, and what would you have liked for it to be, how it would be different, and using that privilege that you have to allow or to facilitate the person of color to have that same privilege.
Right. Yeah.
So if I'm trying to think of a scenario.
I know we didn't prep this, so I'm sorry. It was
just
I was like, oh my gosh, I have to ask this question.
So when, for instance, if a white male goes into a room full of, no, that's not a good one. I'm just thinking how a college student goes into a room with a whole bunch of professors who are 20 years older than them. How does it make you feel? Insecure. You feel as though you have to be more than what you possibly fit, you know, confidence. You're faking it till you make it. Right. You know, you feel like you have to prove yourself. Yeah. So that feeling that you have, use that to minimize that with your friends of color or the LGBTQ community, that marginalized group. What can you do? Can you, if you know that you're in a room and they're sitting back and they're not saying anything, and whoever the majority is in that space is just constantly talking, being able to say, well, you know what? I wonder if Sydney has something to say.
Right. Helping make space.
Opening up that space.
Right.
Yeah. Is important. Always thinking about, I think that when we think of people of color, and this is in not only in counseling situations, advocating, I think that white people will say that was not my intent.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it's not about the intent, it's about the impact. And
Yes.
so being focused on the impact, and it's okay to acknowledge that you made a mistake. That's, you know, people of color are forgiving and they're used to people making this mistake. It's not that you didn't get it right. It's, did you put an effort in? And are you willing to acknowledge that you made a mistake? And how can we move forward versus focusing on, well, that wasn't my intent, and you should understand my intent. Well, that goes back to white privilege. I mean, you're assuming that you're superior, and everyone else is supposed to fall in line.
Yeah, I hope this is okay to bring up, but that just made me think of our emails in preparing for this episode. We had come up with a few questions of like, here are some thoughts we have about this episode and kind of where we want to take the conversation. And I hope it's okay to bring up here, but and you were like, well, the way this one question was worded kind of makes it seem like it's the person of color who has the problem, when in reality it's the system. Right? And I remember I read it and had that moment of like, oh, I didn't mean to say that, but then was like, I'm just going to thank her for pointing that out and inform myself moving forward about like how important language is and the way that we're wording things and like recognizing that, again, that's just very clear that it was my privilege and my lens that was not allowing me to see that perspective. And now that I have, like, I'm grateful for that. So I think that was a perfect example of what you were just talking about, of like, and I think that's a great segue into, we wanted to talk about, like, what does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean to be anti-racist, right? We're seeing this a lot in social media and kind of this push for understanding of it's not enough to just not be racist, right? And like, what does it mean to be actively anti-racist? And I think that's important for anyone, right? Not just students and not just for white students, but people to understand what that means and what that can look like. So I know it's kind of an open-ended question, I guess, but I know that was something we wanted to talk about. So is there anything particularly in that realm of like what it means to be a white ally? Like how can we show up for our students of color on campus and people of color in general?
What?
There's two of Sydney. Wow.
Except the computer died, so I don't know how to. Can you kick me out? You're the host.
Oh, I can. Yes. Go ahead. Sorry, Dr. Gunter. You can.
That's okay. That's okay. So, as I said, in terms of being a strong ally, always center the impact on, pay attention to the impact and not the intent. And then listen and learn from those who are oppressed. I think that, not that I think, I should, and I think that right there is shows of the think of the white, how we have been, it's been ingrained of not being confident in saying, I know. But it's important to listen to those who are oppressed, because we have been ingrained, our system has taught us that white is right. And so oftentimes white people think that they have all the answers. And I would say a lot of times people of color aren't confident in their answers because we have been so socialized to not think that it's okay and that we can meet that standard of white supremacy.
Right.
I would say white superiority. So really being able to listen to those who are around and not just with your ears, but with your heart, to be able to consider and as another human being. I think because the decisiveness in this world right now, in society right now, is based on being able to call others who don't look like you a name, or recognizing that they're human. In order for you to continue that mantra is because you don't see them as a person for whatever reason.
Right.
Then we talked about yield the floor, yield it to speak to other folk, for the oppressed, give them that space and use your leverage of, as a white person, of giving some, well, I'm going to bring this person along with me so that the white people can hear me.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing that and speaking up, that going back to anti-racist, the difference between a racist and an the focus is being an anti-racist actions, being active against racism. It's not okay to sit in the room and listen to those racist jokes and not think that you're not a racist, because what we take in is what we begin to believe. So if you don't speak up, or if you choose to sit there, you're still taking those racist comments in. So anti-racist is being active. What are you doing to stop the racism? If it's individualized racism, systematic racism, institutional racism, are you doing your part to stop it? And it may not, and it could be small. It's gonna be small steps.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be anything large, but are you willing to speak up and be the oddball out with a group of friends and say, you know what, that doesn't make me feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And and they can choose to continue to have that conversation, but are you willing to walk away and go do something else while they do that?
And not tolerate it, right?
Correct.
I think of it the same way as like our bystander intervention techniques.
Absolutely.
Like how, thinking through obviously the lens of like sexual violence and domestic violence. And we talk about like the pyramid. I'm sure you've seen in our programs of like, on the bottom of the pyramid, there are the things you're going to likely encounter on a daily basis, right? And so thinking in terms of like on the maybe a pyramid of like racism and the different acts and things you're going to encounter, you're more likely to encounter, microaggressions and those like subtle racist comments versus like, maybe the actual violence that you might see in the news. You might not see that in your real life, or in your personal life, but you will hear comments or, the like denial and things like that. And those are things that every single day we can stand up and say, I'm not going to stand for this and I don't tolerate this.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that the parallel process of what you're talking about is definitely correct. They're both domestic violence and racism are both social injustices. So approaching it the same way will get the same result.
And because they relate exactly, so by standing up, the words are like standing up against racism, standing up for people of color, whichever way you phrase it, like you're also standing up for survivors, right? And standing against sexual, like it's the same thing, or not same thing, but it's connected. So like by saying, I'm not going to tolerate your racist comment, or, that's not okay with me, you're also standing up for survivors of sexual and domestic violence because they're connected, and vice versa. So
this is just something to think about, because I'm taking a training. It's an 8-week training on uncovering invisible wounds, racial trauma. And the way they have, which I totally agree, to conceptualize it is all people of color have experienced racial trauma on a daily basis. But we're just so used to it. It hasn't been labeled or categorized. And, living in white America, you don't want to.
Right.
But, from the age of 5, when you notice the difference between the white little boy gets away with more than the black little boy in class, that's when racial trauma starts.
Right.
Yeah.
And I like that you gave that example, because I found, like, even just in having conversations with people in my personal life of like, oh, well, maybe, like hearing people say things like, oh, well, maybe they've encountered that. And, just because of the work that that I do, and getting to like work with you and hear you speak in different meetings and things like that, I'm like, no, like what they have experienced 100%, like trauma isn't always this big, giant, major, life-altering thing. It is that, like watching the little examples and then having it add up and add up. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that can help people better connect to what it means when you say, like, people of color have experienced this every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, and I think about the intergenerational trauma too, right? Like that's something that I feel like is so important to mention, of the experiences that you hold and carry.
Absolutely.
Right, from past generations.
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I would love to hear more about too the work that you're doing on campus, because I know there's, excuse me, some newer groups that you've started kind of through the pandemic and responding to a lot of the protests that this year has kind of, we've seen a lot of, but then also things that you've been doing all along on campus. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what you're up to, what your office is up to?
Yeah. We did offer, and unfortunately, we have not had enough. Only one person was interested. We offered a student of color support group, just to talk about how to navigate life as a student of color, particularly at a predominantly white school, and talking about the racial trauma that, that we don't call it that, but we know that we live that. But we only had one person who was interested, which was disheartening. But I think that it also goes back to, a couple things, that the pandemic is really hard, and it has really hit communities of color really hard. And so is that a reflection of people wanting to participate, but not having the time to participate?
Right.
We're not sure if it's the time slot that we have. So I was disappointed, but looking to, hopefully or possibly do that in the fall, in the spring. I also am the co-chair of the Racial Justice Coalition, and that really was out of concern about the Black Lives Matter protest or rally that happened in the summer, and finding out that, having concerns about how were those issues addressed, or if they were addressed. And so it's a diverse group of individuals who are part of the Racial Justice Coalition. It's administrative faculty and teaching faculty. Some administration individuals are on there, and students. So it's across all, walks of our university. And the group basically is committed to promoting racial justice on campus. And so we really want to talk about it, bring attention to the racial injustices, be able to provide support for not only students, but faculty and staff,
right,
if they've experienced racial injustices on campus. And so we've only met twice, but we're working on the mission and vision statement, working on our Instagram and our web page. So we'll have that information and what that process is if someone feels as though they need to have support or a concern they may have. It will not be an investigative group, but more of support, and looking at curriculum and across wide of different areas. So I'm doing that. I'm co-chair with Dr. Karina Battenauer, who's a professor of sociology. So we really wanted to make sure that we had a student affairs and teaching person to be able to bring those things together, because oftentimes we work in a silo.
Yeah.
And then I'm also the chair for the Minority Recruitment and Mentoring Committee for SWAP, which is the administrative union on campus.
Oh, cool.
And really looking to have workshops, professional development around supporting faculty of color. In fact, we have, which is open to the public, to the university. We had one conversation, speak your truth, tell your truth.
Oh, I saw that.
Forgive me if I don't know the title, but beginning the difficult conversation. And we had quite a few people there, and that was administrative faculty of color talking about their experiences on campus.
That's so cool.
And so then on December 10th, we will be having another continuing the difficult conversation.
Cool.
And it will be white administrative faculty of color talking about race. That would be at 12, and we'll have that all on the webpage, and it'll go out with the administrative information that Dr. Missy Alexander sends out. So folks are welcome to attend that. So yeah, in terms of issues of race, that's my involvement. Oh, and we also did an ally workshop, a 2-part workshop for ally, how to be a strong ally. And folks came out for that. So we really are trying to be supportive in the areas of race on campus. I also want to just give a plug for the Counseling Center. We are doing every other week a Creating Calm workshop, which is mindfulness and meditation on stress management techniques and strategies. And we have been doing that all semester and will continue. And then we have Coping Through COVID as well, how to manage the pandemic. So we're in the counseling services, we're trying to cover all the bases.
Yeah.
And if someone, of course, get in touch with Sydney or Cara. If you have any other thoughts or suggestions that folks would like to see us do in the counseling services, we'll try to make it happen.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I love hearing about all the different things you're doing. And I know I see it on social media and like always sharing the Creating Calm, because it's something that students and people really need right now. So, and I think you're not alone in the lack of interest in like virtual things right now. So it's so tough, I think, to get people to connect online. So I hope you get more interest in that support group that you made for the students of color next.
I was also thinking about that support group for supporting students of color. The way we started this conversation was mentioning that when somebody like a person of color, a student of color, whatever, faculty, staff, they're going through something, it's a barrier to getting support, right? Is somebody going to hear me? Is someone going to believe me? Is someone going to see me for what I am? So the pandemic, logistics, like all of these other things, but I found it really interesting, right? That was how we started the conversation. And then you also found that really realistic, example of it, even in just like a support group to support, like it was labeled like supporting students of color. And I would venture to guess, based on what you've taught me today, like that had something to do with it too, whether people consciously knew it or not. That, joining that group, maybe they didn't feel valid and taking up space to have that conversation, even though it was there.
Right. And that's why I felt like, well, I know I'm going to do a different approach next semester and work with, the intercultural clubs and target the individuals and let them know, because it is building rapport and they may not know me or what have you. Because I know when I was a counselor here before, we had a women of color group and we had 13 people involved. Oh. But we talked to advisors. We knew where to reach out to students, and those relationships were there. And I mean, we met every week. So I know it's just a matter of how do you reach out to students to get there to be involved.
Right. Yeah. And add in that nobody's walking randomly through hallways in the student center, and you can't just, oh my gosh, would you be interested in this thing? It's got to be really strategic this semester.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think too, I wanted to mention, in everything that you were talking about of like what you're doing on campus, you also sit on the CART team, which is our campus response and resource team, which is geared at, you know, prevention policy, responding to sexual violence or intimate partner violence on campus. And you do, you know, bring amazing perspective to that group as well. So it's just another way to highlight like the intersection of all of what we've been talking about today.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I think, you know, we've been kind of talking now for like 30 minutes. I'm sorry about what happened with my computer. You know, thank you for bearing with us through technical
life right now. Yeah.
I was trying to decide, do I like look over here and start up this other way of getting into this meeting, or do I like pay attention until this computer dies? And it was just kind of down. But does anyone else have any kind of lingering thoughts? Anything we talked about, maybe mentioning that we didn't get to? The conversation's been so great.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I mean, I know we kind of mentioned this in the beginning, that like, this is not an easy conversation for people to have. And the more conversations we have about it, the more it's out there, the better. So I'm very, very appreciative of you being here today, sharing your thoughts and your perspective and your experiences and expertise. And I'm really hoping, I know this will reach students. So if students have questions and want to like contact you, contact us, like please do.
Absolutely.
You know, our offices work really closely together. We're really lucky to be, you know, close colleagues with you in your office too. So just thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for, you know, teaching us things. Thanks for everything you're doing. And then to like our audience, our students, if you guys have thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out to us. If you have any reactions to the episode and you want to talk to Dr. Gunter, her information is available like all over WCSU's website and stuff like that, but you can contact us via our emails, Cara and I, and we can get you connected as well. Reach out to us via phone, email. We're also on Facebook and Instagram, and Counseling Services is on Instagram as well, right?
Right.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yep.
So, you know, listen to this episode, share it with a friend, let us know your thoughts, and we will see you next week.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.